"We trust your brother more," Dad said. The will said otherwise. "Before I tell you my whole story, let me know in the comments what part of the world you're listening to me from. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 35 years old, and I'm a certified public accountant living in Denver, Colorado. I've always been the responsible one in my family. While my younger brother Jake was partying in college, I worked 2 jobs to help pay his tuition. While he bounced between startups and get-rich-quick schemes, I built my career and helped our parents with retirement planning. I always told myself that family comes first, that being reliable was something to be proud of. But lately, I've wondered if my dedication has been mistaken for weakness. It started small, like these things always do. When Jake's first business failed and he couldn't make rent, guess who got the late-night call? When Mom needed drives to chemotherapy during her cancer scare 3 years ago, guess who rearranged their work schedule? When Dad's arthritis made managing the family hardware store's books impossible, guess who spent every weekend for 2 years modernizing their accounting system? The answer was always the same. Me, Sarah, the dependable daughter, the one who never said no, never complained, never asked for anything in return except maybe a thank you that came less and less frequently as the years went on. Don't get me wrong, I love my family. I chose to help because I wanted to, because I believed that's what family does. But somewhere along the way, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. At family dinners, Dad beamed with pride discussing Jake's latest idea, even though I'd quietly paid off Jake's credit card debt the month before. When relatives asked about us kids, Mom gushed about how creative Jake was, while introducing me as our Sarah. She's so good with numbers, as if that was my only defining trait. The hardware store my grandfather built in 1952 had been struggling. Big box stores were eating into their customer base, and Dad's old-school approach wasn't adapting. I spent countless hours researching e-commerce solutions, modernizing inventory, and designing a website that tripled online orders within 6 months. I did it quietly, working late after my regular job. But when customers complimented improvements, Dad would steer conversation toward Jake's marketing degree and his consulting on business strategy. Jake visited maybe once monthly, usually asking for money or pitching half-baked ideas. Somehow, his sporadic involvement carried more weight than my consistent contributions. I remember the exact moment I felt that cold knot of realization. Dad's 70th birthday party last spring. I'd organized everything: venue, relatives flying in, the photo slideshow that brought tears to everyone's eyes. But when Uncle Mike toasted Dad about his proudest achievements, Dad talked emotionally about watching Jake grow into such an innovative businessman and his excitement about where Jake would take the family legacy. I stood there feeling invisible in a room I had brought together to celebrate a man whose accomplishments I had helped sustain. That's when I knew something fundamental had shifted, and I was about to discover what happens when the dependable daughter stops being so dependable. The cracks became impossible to ignore after Dad's birthday. When Jake's startup folded last summer, leaving him $30,000 in debt, my parents suggested I could help him out, just until he gets back on his feet. This was the 3rd time in 5 years, and each time, the narrative remained the same. Jake was talented and driven, just going through a rough patch, while my steady income was treated as a resource to be tapped whenever needed. I remember sitting in Mom's kitchen that August afternoon, listening to her worry about Jake's future while asking me to cover his rent. "You know how creative types are," she said. "They think differently about money. But you've always been so practical, Sarah." I understood that my practicality was being weaponized against me. Every strength I'd developed was being used to justify why I should sacrifice more, while Jake was shielded from consequences. The pattern extended beyond finances. When Dad needed hip surgery, I took unpaid leave for his recovery. When Mom wanted to redecorate for holidays, I spent weekends painting while Jake was networking. When insurance denied Dad's claim, I fought until they reversed it. The breaking point came at Thanksgiving. Jake arrived 3 hours late with nothing but apologies and a hangover, spending dinner talking about venture capitalists while I served the meal I'd prepared. After dinner, while loading the dishwasher, I overheard Dad and Uncle Mike talking. They thought I was in the garage, but their voices carried through the kitchen window. "I worry about Sarah sometimes," Dad said. "She's so focused on work and helping everyone else that she's never built a life for herself. 35, still single, no kids. I'm grateful for everything she does, but she's missing out on what really matters." Uncle Mike's response made me grip the counter. "At least you don't have to worry about the business with her. Jake's got that entrepreneurial spirit. Sarah's great with day-to-day stuff, but you need vision to grow something." Then Dad delivered the words that would replay in my mind. "Exactly. We trust Jake more when it comes to big picture stuff. Sarah's reliable, but Jake's got that killer instinct. When it's time to make major decisions, we know we can count on Jake to take risks Sarah would never take." I stood there surrounded by dishes from a meal I'd prepared for a family that saw me as a reliable assistant rather than a capable leader. They trusted Jake more with big decisions, but me more with their daily survival. They saw his failures as learning experiences, but would view any risk I took as reckless. That night, driving home through quiet Denver streets, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my resentment. I was tired of being the safety net everyone took for granted, praised for reliability while dismissed for lacking vision. But most of all, I was tired of loving people who only valued me for what I could do, not who I was. Dad was already sick. The will had been updated months earlier, and everything I thought I knew about my family's priorities was about to be turned upside down. Dad's diagnosis came in February. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. He became quieter, more observant, and asked me to sit with him during chemo sessions because he wanted to talk. Those conversations revealed a side of Dad I'd never seen. Regrets, fears, and surprisingly, guilt about how he'd treated me. But he never quite apologized directly. Jake handled Dad's illness predictably. Sporadic visits, expensive gifts as if money could substitute for presents. During the worst weeks when Dad could barely keep food down, Jake was launching his new venture. I took family medical leave and moved back temporarily to help Mom manage Dad's care. I researched treatments, organized medications, handled insurance. I did it because Dad was dying, but also knowing I was again shouldering responsibilities that should have been shared. The conversation that broke something fundamental happened on a gray March afternoon. Dad was having a good day, and Jake had driven up for a rare visit. We were discussing the hardware store's future. "Maybe it's time to expand e-commerce more seriously," Dad said. "Sarah's done good work with the website, but we need someone with real vision." Jake immediately perked up with ideas about social media marketing and influencer partnerships. Mom beamed while Dad nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the innovative thinking we need. Sarah's great with nuts and bolts, but you've got big picture perspective." Then Dad looked directly at me. "We trust your brother more when it comes to major business decisions, Sarah. It's not personal. You're valuable. But Jake has that entrepreneurial instinct you just can't teach." I sat there in the living room where I'd spent countless childhood hours, the dying man whose medical care I was coordinating, whose business I'd quietly been saving, was telling me my judgment couldn't be trusted with decisions that mattered. "I understand," I said quietly, and for the first time in my adult life, I meant it. I understood that I'd been playing a rigged game, that my family's love was conditional on accepting a diminished role, and I understood that my father was about to learn something about trust that would redefine everything. That night, I called Dad's lawyer, Tom Morrison. I asked about Dad's will, about business succession. What Tom told me made me sit down hard in my childhood bedroom, staring at glow-in-the-dark stars I'd stuck to the ceiling at 12. The will had been updated 6 months earlier, and everything my family thought they knew was wrong. Dad died on a Tuesday morning in May, with me holding his left hand and Mom holding his right. Jake was stuck in traffic, running late as usual, arriving 20 minutes after Dad's last breath. Even in death, Dad's timing seemed to make a statement about who had been there when it mattered. The funeral was everything Dad would have wanted. Dignified, well-attended, filled with stories about his integrity. Jake gave a beautiful eulogy about entrepreneurial spirit, and I spoke about dedication to family and community. What nobody mentioned was the will. Tom Morrison had requested a private family meeting for the following week. Until then, everyone operated under old assumptions. Jake started planning to take over the business, talking excitedly about modernization ideas. Mom discussed restructuring to accommodate Jake's leadership, while ensuring I could continue with finances. I listened with strange detachment, like watching a movie where I knew the ending but other characters didn't. Dad had made me promise not to discuss the will's contents until the official reading, and I intended to honor that promise. Jake spent that week networking with potential investors, convinced he was about to inherit a business he could transform. His confidence was stunning, given his minimal involvement in day-to-day operations for years. The reading took place the following Tuesday in Tom Morrison's downtown office. Mom sat between Jake and me, nervous but expectant. Jake was practically bouncing, eager to hear his inheritance confirmed. Tom began reading in formal legal language. The house went to Mom, along with investments for comfortable retirement, small bequests to relatives and charities. Then came the section that would change everything. To my son Jake, who has always brought creativity and enthusiasm to everything he touches, I leave $50,000 and my blessing for whatever path he chooses. Jake's face went through confusion, concern, then panic. But Tom wasn't finished. To my daughter Sarah, who has been the backbone of our family and business for more years than I properly acknowledged, I leave controlling interest in Mitchell Hardware, along with all associated assets. Sarah has proven capable of managing both daily operations and long-term strategic planning necessary to ensure the business continues serving our community. The silence was deafening. Tom pulled out a sealed envelope addressed to me in Dad's handwriting. Inside was a letter that began, "Sarah, by the time you read this, you'll know I've been a hypocrite and a fool. I spent years saying I trusted Jake more with big decisions while relying on you for every decision that actually mattered." The letter apologized for years of diminished expectations, for praising Jake's potential while taking my competence for granted. But the final paragraph made me understand that Dad's public statements about trust had been the lie, and this will was his truth. "I'm giving you the business not as a burden, but as acknowledgement of what you've already proven. You've been running it effectively for years while I pretended Jake could do it better. Now I'm trusting you with official power to match the responsibility you've been carrying. Build something wonderful, Sarah." I looked up to find Jake staring at me with shock and something like betrayal. Mom was crying quietly. This moment was only the beginning. Now I had to decide what to do with the trust I'd finally been given, and whether the family that had underestimated me was ready to accept the person Dad had seen clearly enough to bet everything on. The week following the will reading felt like an alternate universe. Jake went through the 5 stages of grief, except instead of accepting death, he struggled to accept that Dad had seen me as competent all along. First denial. Jake convinced himself there had been some mistake, that Dad must have been confused during his illness. He asked Tom Morrison to review the document for signs of diminished capacity, as if Dad's decision to trust me was evidence of mental incompetence. Then anger. Jake accused me of manipulating Dad, of turning him against his real heir. The irony was staggering that he seemed surprised spending time with Dad during treatment had given me influence. Bargaining came when Jake proposed splitting the business, 50-50 doers, or selling and dividing proceeds. Each suggestion revealed his misunderstanding of both the will's intent and my capabilities. Depression hit when Jake realized his entire life plan had been based on an inheritance that was never coming. But the most interesting reaction came from Mom, who surprised me by being completely supportive. "I always knew you were keeping that business afloat," she said. "Your father knew it too, but was too stuck in his ideas to say it until the end." Word spread quickly through our business community. Dad's decision to leave the business to his daughter, rather than son, raised eyebrows and started conversations. The reaction from my peers was overwhelmingly positive. Several business owners reached out with partnership opportunities they'd never mentioned when they assumed Jake would inherit. The validation felt good, but highlighted how my capabilities had been overlooked due to assumptions about birth order and gender. I'd been managing finances for years, modernized systems, built relationships, increased online sales exponentially. But until Dad's will made it official, many saw me as Jake's future assistant rather than a leader. 2 months later, Jake asked to meet at the coffee shop where we used to study in high school. He looked older, worn down by rebuilding his expectations, but something was different. Less entitlement, more genuine curiosity. All those times I came to you for money. All those times Mom and Dad asked you to help me out. Did you ever want to say no? It was the first time he'd asked about my experience, rather than focusing on his needs. I thought about lying, maintaining the family fiction that I'd always been happy to help. But Dad's letter had given me permission to be honest. "Every single time," I said. "Not because I didn't love you, but because I could see that bailing you out prevented you from learning to solve problems. And because nobody ever asked if I could afford it or what I was giving up." Jake was quiet. "I never thought about what you were giving up," he finally admitted. That conversation marked the beginning of a different relationship. Jake started looking for real work instead of chasing entrepreneurial fantasies. He began paying me back for loans I'd written off years ago. And slowly, he started showing up, not just when he needed something, but when I needed support navigating the challenges of officially running the business Dad had entrusted to me. The most significant change was in how our family discussed success and responsibility. For the first time in my adult life, my competence was celebrated rather than taken for granted. When customers complimented improvements, Mom proudly explained I was the new owner. When relatives asked about the business, Jake talked about my vision rather than pitching his ideas. 6 months after Dad's death, Mitchell Hardware had its best quarter in 5 years. I had implemented inventory software that reduced waste and improved service, expanded our contractor program, and launched community workshops that brought new customers and positioned us as more than just retail. But the real transformation wasn't in metrics. It was in how I saw myself. For 35 years, I'd been the reliable daughter. Now I was the trusted leader, the strategic decision maker, the person whose judgment mattered most when everything was on the line. Dad's public statements about trusting Jake more had been his way of managing expectations, while his private actions told a different story. The will wasn't just financial. It was a reckoning with truth about who had been carrying real responsibility all along. Finally, the person everyone depended on was also the person everyone respected. Standing in the hardware store my grandfather built, surrounded by customers and employees who'd watched me grow from the owner's helpful daughter into the owner herself, I realized the best revenge isn't proving someone wrong. It's proving yourself right. Dad spent years saying he trusted Jake more. But when his legacy was on the line, he trusted me with everything. The trust I'd been given wasn't just about running a business. It was about understanding that my worth had never been dependent on others. Recognition. I had always been capable of making important decisions. Strong enough to carry responsibilities others avoided. Worthy of the respect I was finally receiving. Now, when people ask about taking over the family business, I tell them it wasn't really a takeover. It was making official what had been true for years. Sometimes the person who appears trusted least is actually trusted with the most. Sometimes the will doesn't change everything. It just reveals what was always there. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever felt overlooked despite carrying more than your share, know that your contributions matter even when they're not celebrated. Your reliability is strength, not weakness. Your willingness to show up when others won't is what real leadership looks like. Don't wait for someone else's will to validate what you know about your worth. Trust yourself with big decisions. Take up the space you deserve. Remember that sometimes the people who depend on you most are waiting for you to stop asking permission to be as capable as you've always been. Share this story if it speaks to you. Like it if you've been the reliable one who deserved more recognition. Comment if you've learned to trust yourself even when others didn't. Subscribe for more stories about women who discovered their power by finally accepting they had it all along.